Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Karen Smith.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Aaron Smith.
People in Bristol South look forward to their share of the government's promised 3 million apprenticeships, but they question how this is going to happen. On the eve of National Apprenticeship Week, can the Prime Minister tell us, does he have a delivery plan, or is he making it up as he goes along?
We achieved 2 million in the last Parliament. We're confident of achieving 3 million in this Parliament. We do have a delivery plan. It's based on large companies continuing with their plans for apprenticeships. We want small companies to do more. We want the public sector to join in with larger apprenticeship plans, and we regularly review progress towards the target.
James Berry.
Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents get the train into central London every morning for work, and they are concerned about the terrorist threat posed by Daesh here in the capital. Can my right honourable friend update the House on progress being made in tackling the source of that threat in Iraq and in Syria?
Minister.
I totally understand what my honourable friend said, and it was very striking what Assistant Commissioner Mark Rowley said last week about the dangers that we face. What I would say to him is that domestically we're protecting counter-terrorism policing and investing in our intelligence and security services, as we did in the last Parliament. In terms of Iraq and Syria, we are making good progress at pushing Daesh back, so this is something we need to do both domestically and overseas. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I was completely appalled to see yesterday that the Labour Party has readmitted someone to their party who says, and I believe, that the 9/11 suicide bombers, and I quote, must never be condemned, and belongs to an organisation that says we defend the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Those are appalling views, and I hope the Leader of the Opposition will throw this person out of the party rather than welcoming him in.
Mr. Speaker, I hope the Prime Minister will join with me in mourning the death today of the fifth Beatle, George Martin, and the wonderful music that will last for all time that he gave us. Last week, the Prime Minister told the House that we had a strong economy with a sound plan. If the economy is so strong, then why this week has he forced through a £30 per week cut, hitting some of the poorest disabled people in the country?
Well, first of all, let me join him in what he said about George Martin. He was an absolutely massive figure, a giant in popular music, and responsible for some tunes that will live on forevermore. I find it disappointing he can't comment on the point I made earlier, because it does seem to me we have a responsibility as party leaders for our own parties. Now, he asks about the strength of the economy. We do face an uncertain international environment, and all the experts are warning about the dangers that we face. But as we speak today, we have inflation at 0%, we have unemployment at 5%, our economy is growing, wages are growing, and we're cutting the taxes that people are paying. That, combined with reforming welfare, and we are reforming welfare, is the way to get our deficit down, continue with growth, and help deliver for working people in Britain.
Mr. Speaker, I don't believe that the majority of people in this country are content to see someone diagnosed with cancer today, unfit to work next year, reduced to poverty because of the cuts this government is putting through. In the summer budget last year, the Chancellor found another £6.6 billion to reduce corporation tax for big business, despite our corporation tax already being lower than any other G7 nation. Today, Action for Children, the Children's Society, the National Children's Bureau shows that local authority spending on children and young people has been cut by £2 billion, 71%. Doesn't this demonstrate a wrong choice by the Prime Minister?
Well, let's look at what's happened to corporation tax receipts since we cut corporation tax. That is the question, because the point of setting tax rates is to raise money rather than make a political point. And the fact is, corporation tax receipts are up by 20% under this government. So we've got more money to spend on children, on children's services, on education. Whereas if we put up tax rates, as he now seems to be suggesting, we'd actually get less money in. That is the result. They care about making a political point. We care about raising revenue and providing good services.
I ask a question, Mr. Speaker. If there is more money available to be spent on children's services, why are there another 500,000 children living in poverty in Britain because of the policies of his government? If we really do have the strong economy that the Prime Minister claims, then why did the Chancellor warn last week, and I quote, "We may need to make further reductions"? Who will these reductions fall on? The disabled, pensioners, young people, women? Is he going to rule out attacking those groups?
Prime Minister.
Well, he will see the budget next week when my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, who has an excellent record of steering this nation's economy, will stand up to give that. But the right honourable gentleman just made some remarks about child poverty. Let me tell him what has actually happened since 2010. There are 680,000 fewer workless households. Think about what that means. That is 680,000 households where someone is bringing home a wage, putting food on the table, and under us paying less taxes. There are 40,000 fewer households where no member has ever worked, and there are 480,000 fewer children living in workless households. That is real change for those children. That is about tackling child poverty by having a growing economy, growing real wages, falling taxes, increased childcare, all things never delivered by Labour.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is the number of households that are suffering from in-work poverty because of the insecure jobs, because of zero-hours contracts, because of low wages. As he well knows, the poorest have paid the most for the cuts, and women have paid for 81% of those cuts. Mr. Speaker, on 99 previous attempts to ask questions to the Prime Minister, I've been unclear or dissatisfied by the answers, as indeed many other people have. So, on this auspicious 100th occasion, can I ask the Prime Minister to help out a young man called Callum? Last week, the Prime Minister told the Engineering Employers Federation that we have a skills shortage. A good admission. Callum asks, and he's a bright young man who wants to make his way in the world, says, will the government acknowledge, well, maybe the Prime Minister does as well, will the government acknowledge the importance of sixth form colleges and post-16 education services in Britain?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, let me congratulate the honourable gentleman getting to 100 not out. I'm sure that'll be welcomed across the House. Welcomed across the House. What I'd say to Callum is what we're introducing in our country is a situation where we uncap university places, so as many people who want to go can go, and we're going to be introducing in this Parliament 3 million apprentices. That, combined with better funded sixth forms and better funded FE colleges, means that we've actually got a proper education system that can really drive opportunity in our country. And let me just come back once more on child poverty. Let me give him the figures. 800,000 fewer people in relative poverty than 2010. 300,000 fewer children in relative poverty than 2010. That is the Labour measurement used. So when he gets to the dispatch box, he could tell us he was wrong about child poverty.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister seems to be answering the last question but one. So if I could kindly bring him back to the question I asked from Callum and point out to him that there's been a 10% cut in real terms in sixth form and further education, and adult education has been cut by 35% during his time as Prime Minister. The construction output in Britain has shrunk for 2 consecutive quarters now. Surely this is a matter of concern. Isn't this really a bit of a sign that this economic recovery is being constructed on sand?
First of all, let me just confirm, we have protected 16 to 18 education in this spending round. Now, he talks about construction. Of course, we want to see every part of our economy growing, and our economy is growing, unlike so many in what is a difficult and dangerous world right now. But if you look at our construction plans, because we've got a strong economy, we're able to commit to HS2, we're able to commit to the biggest road programme since the 1970s, the largest rail programme since Victorian times, together with huge infrastructure projects in energy and in other areas. Those things are only possible because we've got a strong and growing economy. And we know what Labour would do. His spending plans are a risk to the nation's finances. His tax plans are a risk to every family in the country. And we know from Scotland what he wants to do, which is to put up taxes on people earning over £20,000. That's their plan, and it would wreck the country's finances.
Mr. Speaker, we have a construction industry in recession at a time that has an acute need for new housing. Construction apprenticeships have fallen by 11% since 2010. We have the lowest rate of house building since the 1920s, almost 100 years ago. Will the Prime Minister look again at this issue, stop the cuts to skills training and cuts to investment that are holding back this country, holding back the skill ambitions of so many young people, and invest in them and invest in our future?
Yeah. Minister. I do have to pick up the right honourable gentleman on his statistics, because we have seen a massive boost to apprentices and apprenticeship funding under this government. 2 million in the last Parliament, 3 million in this Parliament. On housing, let me just give him the figures. House building under Labour fell by 45%. Since then, it's increased by 2/3. Over 700,000 new homes have been delivered since 2010. And if you look at what's happening now, completions are up. Housing starts are at their highest level since 2007. Last year, housing starts were nearly double the low point of 2009. They wrecked the economy. They created that instability. We've been building a strong economy. That's what we've got to stick with.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unemployment in Sherwood has halved since 2010. Given that the Chancellor of the Exchequer will make his budget statement next week, can the Prime Minister assure the House that he will continue to support quality education, employment generation and infrastructure to get to jobs, so maintaining a Conservative ladder of aspiration?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. The school improvement programme that we're driving forward, combined with uncapping university places, investing in apprenticeships, that is giving people a ladder of opportunity to make the most of their lives and the most of the employment opportunities that are clearly being created in our country, where there are 2 million more people in work. I also know he has a particular interest in his constituency in extending the Robin Hood line, and he's meeting with rail ministers to try and deliver this. And that's exactly the sort of infrastructure project that this government wants to get behind.
Angus Robertson.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, the refugee crisis is the biggest issue facing governments right across Europe. Is the Prime Minister ashamed that in a UK government programme, we now know that in Folkestone, trafficking victims were locked up without food, that asylum-seeking children were forced to sleep on concrete floors, that patients with diarrhoea were denied access to showers, and also a naked woman was allegedly beaten at a detention centre? Is the Prime Minister ashamed of this?
Well, I will look very carefully at the points that the right honourable gentleman makes. I would say that our asylum system is fair, and Britain, down the ages, has given people asylum who are fleeing torture and persecution. And when it comes to the issue of resettling Syrian refugees, it was instructive at this week's European Council with the chart showing how many countries have actually resettled Syrian refugees. Britain has done far better than any other country bar Germany.
Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This week, the Scottish Refugee Council called for an investigation into allegations about the way asylum seekers are treated and housed in Glasgow. They want the Home Office to commission an independent inquiry into claims of substandard housing and dehumanising treatment of refugees by the private company contracted to provide accommodation services by his government. Will he commission that investigation?
Minister.
Well, we're very happy for these issues to be properly investigated. The Home Affairs Select Committee in this House of Commons has just done a report into the way that asylum housing is commissioned. And, of course, if the Scottish Parliament wants to carry out those investigations, of course, the United Kingdom government will cooperate with that. What we need to do is make sure that when we take people in, we make sure they're properly housed, properly looked after, their children are schooled, because that's the sort of generous country we are.
Sir Andrew Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government's excellent See Potential initiative to encourage employers to hire ex-offenders. Speaking as someone who myself employs a female ex-offender via the excellent Working Chance charity, could the Prime Minister assure the House of his commitment to ensure employers in the public, private and charity sectors all play their part in providing greater opportunities for ex-offenders?
No, well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I salute what he has done to help ex-offenders. I think the point is this: of course, if people are applying for a job, they have at some stage to declare the criminal record that they have and the offences they may have committed. The question is, do they have to do it absolutely at the CV stage? And we think they shouldn't. We believe in this idea of banning the box. And the civil service is going to introduce this so that you don't have to put that information on the initial CV. You might at least get the chance of an interview, so you're not ruled out. And that is what we're talking about. When we talk about life chances for people in our country and giving sometimes people a second chance to make a go of their life, we're putting our money where our mouth is.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the British people vote to leave the European Union, will the Prime Minister resign? Yes or no?
No.
Government's credit that over 2 million jobs have been created since 2010. But nearly 1 million of those have gone to non-UK EU nationals. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the EU's free movement of people is damaging UK nationals' employment prospects and has contributed to the 1.6 million British people remaining unemployed, and this has not been compensated for by equivalent level jobs in other European countries for UK nationals?
The point I make to my honourable friend is actually, if you look at the figures over the last 5 years, 2/3 of the rise of employment over the last 5 years has been made up by jobs going to British people. Where I would agree with her is in combination with the welfare reform we've introduced for EU citizens and the tougher control of migration from outside the EU, we should see welfare reform in the UK as the flip side of migration control. We want to make sure it always pays for British people to train up, to do the jobs that are being made available. So we should see immigration control and welfare reform together with a growing economy as the way of getting more of our people into work.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's very important that we make the positive case for Britain remaining in the EU? That each of us get £1,200 back for every £120 we put in. We have lower prices and choice in shops, and we have easier travelling for holidays and businesses. Can the Prime Minister explain how our membership of the EU benefits so many aspects of our lives?
I think the Honourable Lady makes an important point, which is in all the arguments about single markets and sovereignty and all the rest of it, we can sometimes lose some of the simple consumer benefits of being a member of the European Union. And the things she mentions about cheaper air travel, ease of travel, not having any tariffs, these are things that we take for granted now, but simply weren't the case 40 years ago. And I agree, that's a strong part of the very positive case that we should make for remaining in the EU. But with her own constituency in mind, I also think we should point to the enormous success of the British car industry, which now employs and is responsible for over 140,000 jobs. That is a great European success story. A lot of those cars go to the European market, and we want to make sure that continues tariff-free.
Ronald J. Wardener.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our security is guaranteed under NATO, and this government's action to meet our 2% commitment is most welcome. I recently visited RAF Odium in my constituency, where the Chinooks that do so much for the United Kingdom and indeed our friends overseas are based. Will my right honourable friend look at plans to improve the quality of accommodation for airmen and women in Odium, which I'm sure he agrees they deserve?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question, and let me, through him, pay tribute to the Chinook pilots and all the crews that service those helicopters. I think I visited Afghanistan something like 13 times over the last few years, and their bravery, their professionalism, their brilliance in flying, often at very low levels, is absolutely remarkable, and they've rightly been decorated and commended for the work they do. We have got an upgrade programme for the Chinooks, which will mean new helicopters replacing part of the existing fleet that's becoming worn out. I think I'm right in saying some £2 million has been spent on RAF Odium, but if more is needed, we'll make sure that happens.
McKinnell.
Thank you. In 1949, aged 11 months, my constituent William Bradney was diagnosed with polio. He has worked from the age of 15. He continues to work at 67. But following a clearly flawed PIP assessment, he's set to lose his Motability card, potentially within 3 weeks. He says it will leave him unable to leave the house and unable to work. Will the Prime Minister urgently review his case and the case of 14,000 disabled people who have lost his essential health?
I would certainly have a look at the case, because what we've found so far with personal independence payments is actually we are spending more money on disability rather than less money on disability. But I'll look very carefully at the case. The whole point about PIP compared to DLA is there is more of a proper medical assessment process to find out what is required. Through her, can I also say to her constituent, I'm sure that he, like all others, will welcome that we are so close to eradicating polio entirely from our world, and this government is committed to going the extra mile and making that happen.
James Cartledge.
Schools in South Suffolk were delighted this week to see the publication of the government's consultation on fairer funding. And given that the first part of this consultation will focus on the core principles, does my right honourable friend agree with me? One of those principles must be to recognise that rural schools face unique and unavoidable costs that are not well funded under the current formula.
Well, I certainly agree with my honourable friend. It's right that we are examining this formula and trying to achieve better fairness. I think that everyone can see now that the figures between the best funded schools and the worst funded schools, that gap has got too great. I also agree with them. It will be vital the specific needs of schools in rural areas are properly considered. That's why our consultation proposes that we should direct additional funding to small schools in sparsely populated areas.
Khalid Mahmood.
Speaker, to follow up the question from my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, official figures show 12,000, it's not funny, official figures show 12,000 vacancies in construction are hard to fill due to a lack of skilled applicants. Can the Prime Minister explain why the number of construction apprenticeships have fallen under him?
Well, the point is we are building more houses, we're investing more in construction, we're training more apprentices, the money is there from the government, and now we're going to have the apprenticeship levy on the larger businesses that will make sure we can fund apprentices long through this Parliament.
Sir Henry Bellingham.
Speaker, the Prime Minister will be aware of a recent tragic fatality on the A17 in Terence Clement in my constituency. Whilst we must await the result of a full inquest and the police inquiry, does he agree with me that it's vital that the local parish council is fully consulted when it comes to looking at new safety measures?
Minister.
Well, I have heard about this tragic accident, and I'm sure on behalf of everyone we should send our sympathies and condolences to those involved. I think he's right to say that in so many of these cases the parish council has a lot of expertise about areas of roads that aren't safe and things that could be done, and of course they should be listened to in this and other cases.
Dr. Roberta Blackman-Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Sunday we celebrated Mother's Day, and just yesterday International Women's Day, and members opposite rightly were keen to celebrate women on both occasions. Why then has this government introduced cuts to public services, a freeze to child benefit and reductions in work-related benefits that have left mothers £13 billion worse off?
So the one thing I share with the Honourable Lady is it was right to celebrate Mother's Day. I shared it with my mother, but I think I probably said enough about her for the time being. What I would say is And also, it was a privilege to welcome to number 10 yesterday some inspirational women from all walks of life to mark International Women's Day. Now, I'm not saying this government has solved all of these problems, but we've got more women in work, they're getting higher pay, they're paying lower taxes, they're getting more childcare, and they're retiring with better pensions. And when it comes to the things that government needs to do, actually, we're appointing more women to senior positions, to public appointments. The honours system is now properly reflecting women. Someone shouted out, what about the pay gap? The pay gap is now at its lowest published level. We have abolished the pay gap for the under 40s. And when it comes to protecting women, this is the government that criminalised forced marriage. This is the government that introduced the duty to report female genital mutilation. This is the government that set out a specific domestic violence measure. All of these, we introduced Clare's Law so people can find out about violent partners. I accept there's more to be done, but let me say this to the Labour Party. One thing you could help with: no more segregated political meetings. Let us end the process of having people with bigoted religious views treating women as second-class citizens. I think you should all take the pledge: no more segregated meetings.
The UK still has relatively poor superfast broadband and far too many mobile not spots. Great work has been done, but what will my right honourable friend be discussing with his right honourable friend the Chancellor in advance of the budget statement next week in how we can improve coverage further, particularly for rural small businesses in areas like mine?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this. Since 2010, we've nearly doubled the number of homes and businesses with superfast broadband. We are on track for the 90% and 95% targets, but there's clearly more that needs to be done. And I think this is something for members right across the House. 10 years ago, I think we were all rather guilty of leading campaigns against masts and all the rest of it. Our constituents now want coverage for the internet, they want coverage for mobile phones. We need to make sure that we change the law in all the ways necessary to make sure the way leaves are granted, the masts are built, we increase coverage, and we make sure everyone is connected to the information superhighway.
Martin Day!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 76% of the cost of a bottle of whisky is tax. Last year, the government's 2% cut on duty increased revenue to the Treasury by £102 million. Will the Prime Minister accept that one of our greatest export products is taxed too much, and will he join in me and the Scotch Whisky Association in calling for a further 2% reduction in duty in this year's budget?
Well, my right honourable friend the Chancellor and I have consistently backed Scotland, Scottish whisky and this vital industry. But let me just say this to him. On the day that the profit and loss account comes out for Scotland, you can see there is a £15 billion gap that Scotland would face if it was outside the United Kingdom. I dread to think what taxation would be had to be levied not just on whisky but on petrol, on work, on incomes, on homes. That's the prospect of life outside the United Kingdom. That's why I'm so glad we voted to stay together.
Sir William Cash!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has just presented three white papers to Parliament under their self-imposed legal duty to provide information under the European Referendum Act. The Minister for Europe, during the proceedings between the two houses, undertook to me that the government information under that Act would certainly, as he put it, be accurate and impartial. The three recent white papers are not. My right honourable friend is the enforcer. My right honourable friend is the enforcer of the ministerial code, which demands that ministers give accurate information to Parliament. Will my right honourable friend issue instructions to Foreign Office ministers to review and correct these white papers?
Prime Minister!
Well, first of all, let me say to my honourable friend, we believe in the sovereignty of Parliament. Parliament dictated that these documents would be published, and that's why they're being published. Now, on the question of their content has been prepared by civil servants under all the appropriate codes. If he doesn't agree with some of the content, I would say to him and other colleagues, challenge the content. Have an argument about the content. Stop having an argument about the process.
Jim Dowd.
Thank you, Speaker. The Prime Minister's notes will indicate to him that I raised the question of the National Wildlife Crime Unit with him earlier this year. I'm delighted to report that its funding has now been secured for the next 4 years. I take full responsibility for that. I read it on my website, so it must be true. But as my mother used to say, it never hurts to say thank you, and I do. Can I ask him on a similar matter how his manifesto commitment to outlaw the use of wild animals in circuses is progressing?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank him for raising such effective questions with such good effect on circuses and wild animals. We have a manifesto commitment. We didn't manage to meet it in the last Parliament. We licence these things so strictly that I think we are now talking about 1 or possibly 2 circuses, but we are still 2, thank you very much, but we are committed to legislating when parliamentary time allows.
David McIntosh.
Later today, colleagues from across the House and I will be launching the all-party parliamentary group on ending homelessness. Will my right honourable friend join me in welcoming the work of organisations around the country, including Nash and the Hope Centre in my own constituency, and pledge that as a government we will do all we can to help homeless people and to address the causes of homelessness so we can end this problem once and for all?
I certainly welcome my honourable friend and the launch of this all-party parliamentary group. We need to work both on the issues of rough sleeping, where we face particular challenges at the moment, and there's some good operations underway to try and deal with that, and homelessness, at the heart of which is the need to build more houses, and that is why we have an £8 billion housing programme to build 400,000 houses, and we hope to build, by the end of this Parliament, 1 million new homes. That is the key. All the arguments about homelessness in the end come down to providing effective homes.
Paul McDonough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A friend of mine works a 39-hour week, including Sundays and bank holidays, on the shop floor at B&Q. Can the Prime Minister imagine his shock when he discovered that he was going to lose money as a result of the introduction of the living wage? That's because to introduce it, B&Q are cutting allowances. As a result, he's going to take home £50 a week less, or £2,600 a year, after the hourly rate goes up. Can the Prime Minister and his Chancellor, in their budget next week, ensure that nobody working on a shop floor takes home less money?
Well, we want to see people take home more money, and that is why we've introduced the national living wage, which will be at £9 by 2020, and we're cutting the taxes of people like the friend to whom the Honourable Lady refers, who will be able to earn £11,000 from the 1st of April before paying any taxes at all.
Mr. Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent study led by Imperial College has shown that biomass, if progressed through the Contracts for Difference, could save bill payers and the Treasury billions of pounds. This is an industry that supports thousands of jobs in the Humber and the jobs and the constituents of my honourable friends for Selby and Cleethorpes. Can the Prime Minister look at this as a sustainable business model here? The biomass comes from the US and Canada. Will he look at this so we can try and get this into the CFD programme?
Prime Minister.
Well, I will look at this, but what we all have to realise is that the levy control framework, the extra amount of money that we're prepared to put into renewable energy, that is a finite amount, and in the end we have to make sure that what we get is cost-effective electricity, that we go green at the lowest cost. That is the aim, but I'll look carefully at what my honourable friend says.
Finally, Mr. Barry Gardner.
Thank you, sir. It used to be said that an English family's home was their castle. But following the government's housing bill, new tenants in social housing will be on fixed 3 to 5 year contracts. Does the Prime Minister think that it's right that a student beginning their secondary education may face eviction at the very time they come up to their GCSEs and A-levels?
We want for more people for their home genuinely to be their own, which is why we're extending the right to buy from council tenants to housing association tenants, so that millions of people will be able to own their own home. As for future tenancies, we want to make sure that social housing is there for the people who need it most. No current tenant is going to be affected, but that's why we think this housing bill will see more homes built, more homes owned, more homes rented, and will be good for housing in our country.
Order!